Welcome to Small Exits, where every small step brings us closer to exit. I'm your host, Taylor Simone, and I'm thrilled to take you on a transformative journey to deepen your understanding of self and the role it plays in your practice. In each episode, we will explore how artists, arts organizers, and educators can harness the power of exits within their practices. Join us as we delve into the vital role of self actualization, positioning practice as an incubator for cultivating both personal and collective power.
Hello, everyone. This is Taylor Simone coming to you with another episode of Small Exits. This episode's title is Gardens of Grief because today we'll be exploring the expansive volume of practice and its capacity to hold space for grief. And we'll ground this exploration by discussing its importance and its relation to what we talked about in last episode, the practice of exiting. So to start off, I just want everyone to take a moment to reflect. I am going to share some questions and I want you to briefly just think about them. What space in your life do you have to process emotions or experiences? How much time do you have to really embody feelings of joy, happiness, or accomplishment? How much time do you have to process things that destabilize you? And do you have time to grieve? When I started asking myself these questions, I found space to answer them within the framework of my practice. And when I was left with that final question of where does the grief have to go, I remember being at this point in my life where I just felt like I was bursting at the seams, that I immediately needed to find that space. And I was just not seeing any place in my life where I could come undone and do that in a safe way and in a space that really allowed for the capacity to fully process that experience. So when I first looked at my practice, I didn't see this space. And before I could carve it out, I really had to validate my own experience and also take a moment to validate my selfhood. I really couldn't embrace dedicating time in my practice to something that didn't really fit within the track that I had put forth that was so closely connected with productivity. And as someone who went through a design education, I felt little validity within interpersonal explorations if they weren't connected directly to something macro or societal. But it was really, really important for me that I did make this room. Moving through that work really helped me to get to the point where I could shift from asking myself those questions to posing those questions to the world. And for me, it became really apparent that this lack of space within lived experience to grieve, to process emotions, to understand self was by no accident. And when I think about grind culture, I literally think about like an overworked gear, something being ground down until it's pretty much unrecognizable. It benefits a system like capitalism that has this primary goal of making profit, of producing, of making as much profit as possible with as little cost, to constantly just have laborers who are working nonstop and not really exploring the modalities that could potentially put someone in a position to challenge the notion of 24/7 labor. So, what within a process of grief would produce a sense or something that would challenge that notion? When I think about that, I really think about just like the idea of stabilization. So, the stabilization that comes through healing, through moving through trauma work, through rest, and a part of healing and trauma work can be giving yourself time to rest, to be in community, time for personal growth, for self-actualization, also time to really question and explore things that sit outside of the framework of capital. I think that space outside of the framework is really where humanity lives and finds a home. And when you move through the world with a deeper understanding and a reverence for not only what you've experienced, but the things in your life that have impacted your selfhood, you gain this reverence for your experience in selfhood. And that reverence sits in relation to, like I said, community and your capacity to name boundaries and to really understand society, and that groundedness and the things that you understand about yourself and the world really can create more room for practicing refusal and really can create more impactful disruption. And when I say more impactful, I'm talking about more sustained disruption. So now I just want to quickly talk to you about the importance of making space for grief and the ability for practice to hold those spaces. So to ground us in that vein, grief is often associated with the death of a loved one, but there are a lot of different types of losses that we experience in our lives that prompt the need for processes of grief. And a body of work that I created a couple years ago called Gardens of Grief, I define grief as the process of relearning one's sense of self once a loss has occurred. And one of my favorite talks by Bell Hooks, which unfortunately isn't available to the public anymore, Domination, the Struggle Continues. They speak to the idea of domination culture and the fact that we live in a culture of power struggles, that we're always within one of two positions of a binary that is loss or gain. So many navigate losses of power on a daily basis, from the micro to the macro. And that can look like an interpersonal experience in relation to the world, or manifest as an external experience, as something externally emotional, or even like a physical threat. And on top of that, there are still the losses of the things that we hold dear. So that may be an object, emotional states, environments, projects, or even just ways of being that we once were allowed to explore that have been taken away from us or that we're not able to anymore. And when a loss occurs, it makes it very apparent that the things that we hold dear, hold close to our chest, really give meaning to who we are and how we position ourselves in the world. And processes of grief are so important because grief really takes that fragmented sense of self and it repositions or recalibrates or realigns us to a direction or a way of being that we can hold on to moving forward. It gives us a new sense of wholeness. And that, in my experience, really made me feel even more deeply connected to my lineage. And moving through those processes are hard, of course. They can be devastating. But throughout the process, there are these pockets of comfort, there's feelings of warmth and this peace that I have gained through those processes that sit in relation to the things that unfold and the things that you learn about yourself in those spaces. So the capacity for my practice to support and honestly, in a lot of ways, to facilitate those processes, along with resources, because I got to keep it funky. Therapy and things like that did help me along the way and actually made me feel safe to open up those explorations in my practice. Not everyone has access to that. And it's important to note that some grief is so intricately connected to trauma that you need external resources to really help you navigate that. And practice may not be able to hold those things or hold you safely enough to explore them. So, anyways, when I realized the capacity of my practice to function in that way, that's when I first started using the language of magic in my practice. It was something that I sat in awe of. Just truly, I always knew that my practice could be transformative in an interpersonal way, but the depths of that transformation and the space that it allowed me to feel in really was so expansive and so deep and so needed at that time that it did feel like a space of deep spirituality and magic. So when it comes to making space for grief and practice, I really used to think in a very compartmentalized way about my practice, that either I had to work in a very pointed way on a very macro scale and be addressing societal issues, and what felt very separate were these interpersonal explorations that kept rearing their head into my practice, because even before I knew that I needed that space, there was a way that my mind kept circling back to that because I wasn't getting the space to process in my lived experience in my daily life. And I think because of my design background, I did feel that the more societal and pointed work was more valid and maybe less cliche, which is, no, we could talk about unpacking that word cliche for a whole episode. But I did just feel that one was more valid than the other. And I've realized that with ritual and intention and just deeper understanding, that those pockets really do live side by side. They're in a lot of ways inseparable. One informs the other. And at the end of the day, the work that I do to better understand myself and my positionality in this world really helps me to better understand why it is that I'm practicing, how it is that I'm practicing, and what I really want people to get out of the work that I'm creating. There's a way that starting with myself really poured into almost a call to action. It really gave definition to the lens that I want to use to magnify these things that are happening on an interpersonal level and the ways that they tie back to what's happening in society. And I think within the word or the title of that body of work, Gardens of Grief, lies a really beautiful intention. You know, gardens are these intentional spaces within our home or our community where beauty and life is cultivated. And a part of that cultivation is really understanding the ways that death ushers in new life. So when I think about this, I just want to invite you to think of cultivating spaces for grief within your practice. And the beautiful thing about these processes of grief is that they open up space for so many emotional landscapes to sit side by side and inform each other, just like a garden would. All the things that I processed, all the intense emotions, whether that be anger, denial, sadness, celebration, reverence, really holding memories dear and close. All of those things are interlaced with insight, interlaced with newfound understanding, and grief can really function as this space of deep, deep, deep reflection. And like I said earlier, for me, that process also really opened up a deeper connection when it comes to thinking about lineage, my legacy, spirituality, and what it means to carry on with when a loss has occurred. And within that, my spiritual practice really started to open up, and in terms of really understanding the importance of embracing grief as a way to hold the past in a way that isn't laced with sadness or denial, but really understanding that the ways that I move forward and the things that I engage with all carry those things that once gave such deep insight to my selfhood and the ways that I position myself in the world. And that has really given me so much life within making, within just everything. And again, I bring up this topic of grief because I really feel like it's an important part of actually self-actualizing and going through processes of transfiguration where you are really gaining deeper insights to yourself in a world that is ever changing, with a spirit that is ever changing. That's important to carve out space to really embrace that and to be mindfully understanding that you are growing, that you're expanding. And next, I'm going to talk about specifically how it relates to the practice of exiting. But I also want to just address that another part of me wanting to talk about this is just feeling that we have just gone through such a collective sense of grief. You know, the pandemic arguably ended a couple years ago, or the ways of our old ways of being kind of opened back up to us. But it's still something that I'm grappling with. We moved through so much loss and collective grief outside and within the art community. And I don't know about y'all, but I'm forever changed by that. And there was such a deep sense of collective instability. Our lives were disrupted, and that disruption rippled across all corners of the globe. And when I feel like I connect with somebody about those struggles during that time, it really highlights that question, where is the space to grieve? It seems like the experience of really moving through that and grieving it is so siloed, but the actual experience in itself was so interconnected and collective. And just knowing that and sitting with that really also pushed me to talk about grief in practice and ways of opening that up within your practice, because I do think that it is worth exploring and making room to really process that moment within our society, within our reality. So we're going to round out this discussion by just grounding it in relation to exiting. So in the last episode, we talked about what exiting was and why it's important to practice this liberatory framework. And just to reiterate, exiting is an act of creating space that redefines labor, allowing for explorations without the goal of finality or pressure or productivity. It produces a sense of safety that allows for processes of self-actualization, deeper relation, and reverence towards materials, and new understanding of both personal and collective power. For me, this sits kind of like hand in hand with processes of grief. Like I said, grief is a process that allows you to re-understand or relearn your sense of self when a loss has occurred. And calling back to what I mentioned earlier, just about the lack of space there is in our society to process any type of emotion, but especially grief, we can definitely look at that as just an impediment to us really understanding the power we have within ourselves, the magic that we have in ourselves, and the power we have within a lineage of things that have poured into the basis of who we are and why we move the way we move in the world, I would consider grief as umbrellaed under exiting, making space for yourself to process, to rest, is an act of liberation. It is the work of abolition, and it directly challenges what it is to be in relation to labor. And allowing yourself to grieve, allowing yourself to process emotions is a part of that map of self-actualization. And it's one of the things that really allows us to redefine our relationship to labor. Okay, so now that we've talked about grief and its relation to practice and its relation to exiting, I just want to take a moment to end this episode by sharing some prompts with you for practice. So, what I want to share with you is a really simple prompt, which is to reflect on that question, where does the grief go? And I do want to expand on that by also adding a shift to that. So, how does it shift my practice? And when I talk about shifting practice, what I mean is really, how does the work of grief or the work of processing grief within the context of the work that is created that becomes a vessel for holding those processes, how does that new understanding of self help you to better understand why it is that you're making, who you are in position in relation to within your practice? And through those processes of exploring grief within your practice, whether it be writing or creating work, what processes, what aesthetics, what understandings just shift the way that you go about making when it comes to work outside of that scope. So I want to challenge you to just spend some time writing about this in terms of free writing. And then a second prompt I want to share with you that you can write about is just, how do those things that you've lost or the things that you hold dear to you, how have they really informed who you are and how you position yourself in this world? Specifically, how do they remain in your life? How do you hold reverence for them within your practice after an initial loss has occurred? Because we lose things, but the understanding, the memories, the relation we had to that thing is something that we do not lose. It stays with us. So how are those things uplifted in your practice, especially for those who consider themselves archivers, who consider themselves explorers of lineage, elevators of lineage? And I just want to finish with this caveat that I am not a trauma-informed practitioner, and I want to make that very clear. And I want to make that very clear. As I mentioned earlier, I had to seek out resources such as therapy to move through specific grief that was tied to trauma. A loss of any kind, whether you see it as major or minor, can be traumatic. And I give this caveat just to say, be careful about what you open up. And if you're opening up something that you know is heavy, that it may be hard to close, and that may cause an emotional disruption after you leave the space of practice. So I ask that you be very aware of the resources that you do have, the support system that you do have to help just tidy and close that space of grief up. Also, so you can form rituals of closing. But like I said, there are just some things I know that I cannot open up and other things that I know that I do not want to touch without the help of a professional. And that is just on the real. So yeah, with all of that, I hope that this conversation has inspired you to think about grief within your practice. And I hope that wherever you are, that you're finding time to pour love, joy, and really gain a deeper understanding of yourself in relation to practice. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and I can't wait for the next one. So I will see you soon.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Small Exits. Looking for more extensive prompts and exercises? Check out this week's episode's bonus content for a one-time purchase of $3 at exodusexpress0.gumroad.com. Your purchase supports Exodus School of Expression, so that's exodusexpress0.gumroad.com. We hope you found inspiration, new perspectives, and practical tools that deepen your practice. Remember, small exits can lead to exodus. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss out. And please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback means the world to me and helps me continue delivering valuable content. Stay connected with us on our social media platforms. Follow us on Instagram at Exodus_expression and TikTok at Exodus Expression. Thank you for being part of Exodus School of Expression's community. Until next time, this is Taylor Simone signing off from Small Exits.